Welcome to the ASHA Leadership Academy webinar, High Performing Teams. This webinar content is appropriate for entry and emerging leaders. I am Andrea Falzerano, Director of Association Governance Operations at the ASHA National Office. We planned today's webinar to help audiologists and speech-language pathologists feel confident leading teams at work, in the community, and as a volunteer at the state and national level. Each of you should have a copy of the handout, which includes speaker information and slides. If you do not have the handout, please pause the webinar now and access a copy from our website. You will need a copy for interactive sections of this presentation. At this time, I would like to welcome our presenters, Kevin Norse and Alice Wagen. Dr. Kevin Norse is an executive coach, organization development consultant, and facilitator with nearly 20 years of progressive experience in both for-profit and nonprofit organizations. He is a professional certified coach through the International Coach Federation and has extensive experience coaching leaders in the areas of emotional intelligence, career planning and transition, influence, risk-taking, and strategic thinking. Dr. Alice Wagen is a business consultant who teaches management skills to business leaders. Alice has conducted hundreds of workshops and training classes at many of the country's top Fortune 500 companies, nonprofit organizations, and government agencies in the Washington, D.C. area. In just the last 5 years, more than 132 leaders from 26 regional organizations have graduated from her unique leadership development workshop series. Now let's begin. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, we want to welcome everyone to the Leadership Academy webinar on high-performing teams. We're happy to have you all participate in the webinar, where we'll be exploring tools and techniques associated with sustaining team performance. So our hope is after the webinar you'll have some practical tools that you can use immediately. I would like to review our disclosure statements. I am Kevin Norse. I am the principal of Norse Leadership Strategies, and I'm an independent contractor. I'm being financially compensated by ASHA for the Leadership Academy webinars, and I do not have any non-financial interests with ASHA. My colleague Alice Wagen is a subcontractor to Norse Leadership Strategies. She is also an independent contractor, financially compensated by ASHA for the Leadership Academy webinars, and without any non-financial interests with ASHA. And I should say at this point that we've got two audiences for our webinar. We've got participants in the classroom we'll be interacting with, and we have those that are listening to the recorded audio, the webinar. For those that are listening to the recording, throughout the webinar we'll be using certain reflective questions to engage the group and conceivably deepen your learning. So we would invite you at that point to hit the pause button, capture some notes or some thoughts on your handout or in your journal, and then when you're ready to resume, just hit the replay button and join us. So with that, I'll toss to my colleague Alice to give us the roadmap where we're headed today.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I likewise want to welcome everyone today to this webinar. I feel it's a very critical topic, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But what are we going to be doing today? We're going to talk about the fundamentals of building and maintaining high-performing teams. As my graphic illustrates, we're going to be doing sort of a high flyover of these topics. These topics have got a lot of weight and meat to them, but we're going to basically focus on three key areas. First, we're going to give us a definition of key concepts, but then we're going to talk about stages of team development, the role of the team leader and how it needs to evolve over time, and lastly, what are the components of an effective team? As Kevin mentioned, our goal in this webinar today is for you to leave with some very sound, practical, easy-to-use tools that you can use to evaluate current teams you're working on to make them more effective, and also to use to plan future team efforts for success. So Kevin, you want to talk to us about what is a high-performing team?
Sounds good, Alice. You know, if you Google teams on the internet, you'll find millions of hits. So a lot has been written about teams. There's a lot of definitions out there, but we've constructed this definition based on our experiences and just a review of what we found. And I won't read it to you, but there's some points I do want to make associated with what is a high-performing team. Well, we think about, the size of the team. Generally, it's a relatively small group, typically 8 to 10 or 8 to 12. And what's really key is the idea of a shared vision. So in essence, it's ultimately what unites a team is the sense of shared vision about what everybody's working toward. The other part of that is that you've got team members that have varying and unique skills and talents. Because if everybody had the same skills, in essence, there would be no value add in having a team in the first place. The third key element highlighted would be the idea of creating outcomes that far exceed that of any one individual. In other words, the contributions of the overall team is larger than the individuals, which makes a huge difference. And then also, the point about mutual accountability, what we know is that beyond just traditional work groups with boss managing team, teams really embody this idea of mutual accountability. So there's interactions dynamically between team members, and accountability doesn't come just from the team leader, but it's shared throughout the team so that it reinforces kind of the key vision and the key elements of how the team functions. Alice, anything you want to underscore in our definition?
Yes, well, that last point, mutual accountability, is, I think, so important. A high-performing team does what we call, they self-correct. So, they're working along and everyone's doing what they need to do, and then one member starts to not be performing, not showing up, and not doing the work. A non-high-performing team, it's like, well, let's get the leader to go talk to them. A high-performing team has mutual accountability. The members will gather around and say, what's up? How are we going to fix this? And I think that's, one hallmark of a really good high-performing team.
That's great. That's a good reinforcement. And I think many times, we're brought in to work with teams to help them resume and regain their performance. One of the first questions we ask is it really a team? So as team diagnosticians, we work with teams around that. And ultimately, I think we go back typically with teams to ask these questions. Is it a work group or is it truly a team? Because becoming a high-performing team takes work. It's not something that just happens automatically. So at this point, Alice, I think you're going to just do a bit of a lit review in terms of some of the emerging research.
Absolutely. But first of all, let's just pause a minute about the criticality of this topic, especially as a topic for the Leadership Academy. I can't envision a successful leader, who isn't really good at pulling together teams and getting teams to work well together and to be productive. No matter where we are, whether it's the professional world or whether it's our volunteer world, so much of what needs to happen can't be done by a single individual. It has to be done with people working together, with various forms of direction from a leader. And so, to me, if anybody wants to advance in the world of leadership, this is definitely a stop on the road, and one to continually hone your skills in. Being a valuable team member and a valuable team leader is, I think, essential to advancing one's leadership. Now, we always like to start these webinars by just touching on some current research and some evidence-based research supporting some of the theories and practices that we'll be presenting today. I just want to highlight a few of them. The first article here I was very fascinated to read. Essentials for a Great Team: Trust, Diversity, Communication, and Joy. I love the way they added that. This is put out in the Journal of the American Board of Family Medicine. So it's research based in the healthcare system. And, I think the four things that they itemize here, especially the trust, is really critical for a high-performing team. The next article, Enhancing the Effectiveness of Work Groups and Teams, our authors there did a real deep dive in over 50 years of psychological research looking for what contributes to effectiveness in teams. Anyway, I could go on. There's great articles here. So those of you who are listening to this webinar, if you want to dive more into these topics, these are great articles, as well as we have a bibliography in the back that you can advance your learning on this area. Kevin, I think we're ready to do a little bit of reflection on teams.
That's right. So our first question, reflection question that we'd like to pose to you is the idea of what are your biggest challenges associated with working in a team? So thinking about past teams that you've been a member of or current teams, what do you see the big challenges? For those of you listening to the recording, now would be a good time to hit the pause button and take a moment and reflect in your journal. And those in the classroom, we'd love to see what thoughts you have. Alice, what do you notice in terms of some of the teams you're working with and their challenges with your clients?
Yeah, I think one of the most challenging issue with teamwork is having that when the members have different workloads and priorities beyond the work on the team. Sometimes that can get to be a tense situation if half of the team is under a huge crunch, heavy deadlines, high priority work, and the other half isn't. If they don't negotiate how to manage that up front, be very, very clear and negotiate. Maybe the ones who are in a slack period can take more of the work, coming up for a while, or maybe the ones that are really overloaded can, have a mini sabbatical from the team. If they don't talk about these things, what happens is a lot of resentment builds, and then we get into all kinds of issues from there. So that's one that I see that frequently hits work teams.
That's great. I recall in some of the stories we've heard from audiologists and speech language pathologists in past leadership development programs, for many of our participants, it's been the challenges, for example, of working on interdisciplinary teams in their workplace, and the idea of navigating different disciplines who have different kind of philosophies and perspectives in terms of working with patients or clients, and reconciling that, and especially around conflict, and how do you navigate conflict in a team context with people that think very differently in some cases about what's the right way to support a patient or a family, that kind of thing. So let's take a look at some of our classroom participants, some of the ideas that they shared. Ned points out, making sure everyone has a shared goal, which is really such a core definition of what it means to be a team. And then the challenge is, how do you know people really do share that in terms of surfacing those differences? Marilyn points out, making sure that all team members are heard. You've got some people that may be more quiet or introverted, and others more extroverted. So how do you manage that dynamic when certain people may dominate a conversation? And I think that gets back to making sure everybody has a place at the table and an ability to speak and be heard. Anything you notice, Alice, in our participants' observations?
Well, communication comes up a number of times, and I think that is, again, one of the issues of being really planful and conscious and intentional about communication and putting issues out there, I think is really important.
Great. Well, I think at this point, you're going to take it and start us down the path of stages of team development.
Yes, I certainly am. This is the first of the models, the tools we're going to be sharing with you. And many of you on the webinar may have already heard of this at one point or another. There was a researcher by the name of Bruce Tuckman, and he put together this model for team development. Basically said that over the life of a team, there's different phases or stages that the team will go through: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. This is not a new model. He really published a paper in 1965 documenting the first four phases, and then added the last phase in 1977. Now, why is it still around? I mean, some of you might be asking. Well, it's very simple to begin with. The mnemonic device of everything rhyming, I think, helps people to remember. But it's very real world. It's very observable. It is a behavior-based tool whereby watching your team observing behavior, observing what people are saying, you really can place where they are in this model. And in that way, take actions and behaviors to guide the growth of the team. So let's start by looking at this in a little bit more detail. I'm going to describe these first two phases. Phase one, or stage one, I should say, is the forming stage. The team has just gotten together, brand new team. People may not know each other or know each other just in a superficial way. And so in the forming stage, people are sharing information, talking back and forth, and conversing, trying to really understand each other better. They're trying to learn about each other. Who is this person sitting across from me? Are they warm and friendly? Do they feel a little bit reserved to me? What are some issues people are bringing to the team? It's a very pleasant phase in the sense that people are, just trying to get to know each other. Most of the times, conflict is avoided and serious issues are avoided because we're really just trying to get to know each other and to get forming. Now, after a while, though, we're going to be moving into our storming phase. And storming is just as the name implies. People are expressing their opinions, their values, and their beliefs. In forming, you kind of got to know who they were, but we want to know what's going on in their head, what's going on in their heart, what are they bringing to the team. And so there is confrontation and there is controversy as these issues come out. Now, before we get into the remaining phases, I will point out there is a positive and a negative side to each of these stages. And if we're in a stage too long, that negative can kind of come up and overwhelm. So stage one, getting to know each other, is incredibly important. Team needs to spend time here. If the team stays there too long, it gets stuck. Conflict doesn't come to the table, and our learning gets stuck in a way, and we don't really bond and move forward. In the storming phase, if the arguments and controversy pursues, sometimes the conflict can step over a line and get a little bit too personal and can really damage interpersonal relations. So spending time to meet the stage's purpose makes sense. Spending too much time, it's a process of what we call getting stuck, and we'll talk a little bit later how to unstick a team that may be, stuck in a phase too long. Kevin, anything you want to add to our first two stages?
I would just underscore, the importance of storming, because really what is happening, it becomes a power struggle. Who's got power? Who's losing power? But also it's that stage that we're still stuck in our own silos, our own agendas. And of course, the key for a high-performing team is to transcend that, so we're holding a more universal or team agenda. But it's in that storming stage that those dynamics come to the surface and can be painful for some people. But again, good teams work through that, and they've got processes that we'll talk about. So let's talk about the next three stages of development specifically. So now, now that we have stormed, the idea is moving into a stage of development where we're consciously talking about what we've learned and how we're going to really function together. And so it's during this stage that we actually articulate key processes, clarify objectives, clarify goals, clarify the roles on the team and what individuals are doing. And also clarity of purpose. It's revisiting why are we here together and a roadmap to achieve these results. I'm working with a team in a large medical center, a senior executive team, where they formulated a team charter to identify important ground rules, for example, for how meetings are to be handled or how they're going to navigate conflict. What are going to be some operating norms and rules, because then we can observe whether those rules have happened or not. We then move into the performing stage of development. And this is that sweet spot that we all long for. And it takes work to get there. But you'll find in the performing stage that interactions become very fluid and dynamic. Issues come up, they're easily resolved. And so, whereas in earlier stages we may get stuck, generally in performing, issues are dealt with in a real-time basis, and the team is producing. You can see that. So it's not just we're stuck in our process, but we're very fluid in our process, which means the outcomes of the team were able to achieve some real leverage and some take advantage of the advantages of the diversity of the team to produce some really solid outputs. We then think about really the final stage. Now, some teams don't go through this because they're an ongoing team. In other words, they don't end. But there are instances when teams do come to an end. And it's funny because I think all of us have been on teams that we were sad to see it end because it was such a wonderful dynamic and productive. In this case, the team is feeling these feelings, the emotions of an ending, and the sadness and loss that goes with this. The best example I can think of, I did my doctoral research in New Orleans, and I interviewed people in organizations that went through Hurricane Katrina to look at those that really thrived and how managers thrived. And in many of the institutions, particularly in healthcare settings, these teams were basically living together on the property of their employer because they really couldn't go home. So they formed almost quasi-family teams, family systems to support them and also help their organizations reopen. And I remember hearing these stories in my interviews about how hard it was to end it. And it was a painful experience, but because they brought these teams together, they functioned really well. They were incredibly resilient because they had the support of each other. But when it came to an end, it was really hard for them because of all they had been through basically in the battle trenches together. So let me stop and pause and just see if my colleague Alice, what would you add to these final three stages?
Well, there's a couple sort of rules that go with Tuckman's model. Rule number one, a healthy team goes through all of these phases, although as you mentioned, Kevin, stage 5 may be optional. But teams that try to accelerate and say, oh, we're really good, we're just going to skip storming and move off, generally in the performing, they'll trip over things that should have surfaced earlier. So you have to go through all of these stages to really be high performing. Now, how much time you spend in them can vary tremendously depending on the team. I've seen teams reconvene over an issue and, within a 1-hour meeting, they've worked their way up to performing. I've seen teams that have taken 6 months to get to performing and beyond. The other issue is whenever the team changes in any way, a new member is added or someone leaves, you really have to start over. So team membership changes makes the team start over. And in my experience, where I've seen this happen, and again, a savvy team will move through it quicker, is on volunteer boards. Board usually have board positions have tenure. So whether it's a 2 or a 3-year tenure, whenever that tenure comes up, the team changes completely. Or some of the members drop off and others are added. And again, the board has to go back and go through all these phases or stages again. All right. Any other thoughts on our stages model, Kevin?
No, I think we're good to go to our next reflection question.
All right. So once again, let me set the stage for the reflection, and then we'll ask those of you listening to the recording to hit pause and spend some time with this question. So what I'd like you to do, everybody, is to think of a team you're currently leading or serving on as a member. In other words, get this a real fresh memory for you. A current team, you may be leading it or you may be a member of. What stage of development is the team in now? And how do you know that? As I mentioned before, Tuckman's model is observable. So what are you observing of the team members' behavior that you base this on? So sort of play back some recent meetings. What are you observing? What stage do you think that would mean that your team is on? So again, those of you on the recording, press pause and give some thought to this. Sort of use the model. Those who are live with us today, if you could go ahead and just share your experiences, that would be great. Kevin, can you think of a team you're working with that you could figure out where on Tuckman's model they are presently?
Yeah, I'm I've got a client here in Southern California Medical Center. I'm working with the CEO and his executive team. And I started last fall, and we made really good progress with a team of 7 folks plus him. We got to some level of new level of performance. He then, a couple of his team members left, and so basically we're hitting the reset button. We'll try to salvage some of the work and the agreements that they came up with before in the team vision, but we've got to revisit that because it really is a new team with some very different players on the team. And so exactly, we go back to square one in terms of building relationships and revisiting, again, team purpose, team vision, things like that. How about you?
Well, I was just going to comment. You are so right, because that's the gasoline that drives the engine, so to speak, is the purpose and vision. We'll talk a bit more about that shortly. And new members may not have that coming into it, so I think that's really being conscious and thoughtful and intentional. Take them back to the beginning and walk them through it. Mandy says shares with us a very important example here. She's a member of the patient satisfaction team. The team was at a performing stage, made lots of positive change in a short period of time, increasing patient satisfaction. However, had staff turnover and are currently back to the storming stage. Yeah, a great illustration, Mandy, of exactly what I was speaking of. It just drives you crazy. You get to that performing, everything's great. You add new members, you've got to backtrack. Nad mentions had a change in the team leader, a change in the role of the assistant, new staff member, 3 new interns. Yeah, you're back at the beginning, reforming and building relations. Absolutely. That much change, just start over, back at forming. Melissa's experience added directors to our leadership team. 6 of us have been working together in leadership team, so adding 2 more members put us back in the forming. And Melissa, I'm so happy you're acknowledging that. When you have 6 and then you have 2 new people added and 4 old, if you're not careful, you get little mini coalitions going where the 4 existing team members want to continue on as high performing and not looking to bring those 2 new ones into the fold. That can get to be a problem. Marilyn says, on an IPP team planning interdisciplinary workshop, the second time working there, I've noticed that this year's planning has been easier and more efficient because we've been interpersonal understanding. There's more relationship among, So that's another good point, that even though you're coming back a second time, you can capitalize on the groundwork you did the first time. You still have to go back to forming and storming, but it's probably going to be easier and shorter in those phases than if everybody was brand new. Well, thank you. Our live group out here gave 4 really great examples of how this process works. And it's why I do think Tuckman's model has been around forever and will be forever, because it's evergreen. It's based on human behavior and observation, and it can help you so well to really observe and plan to move the team as rapidly as it makes sense to get it to high performing. So Kevin, I think you are going to take us to the start of the role of the team leader.
That's right. So now that we have a sense of the stages that teams go through and and how important it is to diagnose where you're at and how to move toward performing or sustain performance, let's think about those of you that may play the role of the team leader. You play a really important role as team lead in terms of your behavior and how it impacts the team's functioning. And so the idea is, how can you as a leader establish and sustain high performance? Well, it really boils down to 3 strategies. For you to pay attention to team behaviors, certainly your own experience is important, but what do you observe in what's happening with others? And then identifying and formulating some strategies to intervene if in fact you all are not in that high performing stage. And then the idea is reflecting on the impact. So it's as much an art as it is a science in terms of team intervention, because every group is so dynamic associated with that. So that's the larger frame in terms of your role. Let's look at a little bit more in terms of specifics depending on the stage that you're in. So we're going to, Alice and I are going to explore these trade-off in terms of our conversation now. So we start at the forming stage, and if you think about when you've been on a team, generally speaking, people feel pretty tentative. They're excited, but they're a little, arm's length because not sure who's on the team, why are they here, what's my role, is it a safe place? They're asking those questions. And so effective team leaders at that stage can really reinforce the purpose and objectives for why are we here. And so everybody's really leaning on the role of the team lead. So and when you're in that role in this specific stage, it's really important you provide a bit of the backbone for the team because at this stage they're fairly dependent on you. We then move into the storming stage. And again, as Alice suggested, the power struggles, you've got conflict that potentially could be destructive. And so your job at that point as team lead is to surface and mediate the conflicts. In essence, I call it normalize conflict so that people feel okay about surfacing differences of opinion, raising concerns, giving people a voice. And also an important role for you as a team lead is to sustain optimism, because I've intervened with teams where people get a little bit like disillusioned about the team and its ability to get anything done. But again, as a team leader, and reinforcing this is a normal part of what we need to go through, and we will get through it, and we will achieve our team vision for what we intended to achieve here. We then move into the norming stage, and again, the key there is articulating and negotiating agreements. So as a team lead, perhaps that's a great place to step in and facilitate a conversation around the idea of where have we been, what have we learned, and what's going to help us get to that next level. And so it's about giving more and more of the team a voice. So you might think about it in terms of as we advance these stages, you're pulling back a bit as the team lead and letting the team step up. And so maybe someone else could facilitate this conversation. It doesn't have to be you. So again, it's paying attention to your own perhaps need for control and also stepping back so that you can let the team step up, which is on the path to becoming more of a self-managed team. Alice, I think you're going to take the final two stages, and any other comments on the first three?
Yes, I will definitely do both of those. I think I could say in the performing stage, what a team leader needs to do is basically step away. We have here monitor and sustain performance, but in reality, what happens in a high-performing team is leadership is very fluid. Depending on what's on the table and what's being discussed, leadership may shift from one member to the other. In fact, oftentimes people say if you videotaped a high-performing team and later said, pick out who the leader is, you couldn't do it. Because 1 minute it's one person stepping up to say, I think we should be doing this, and then they're passing the baton to somebody else. It's really a lovely thing to witness. An analogy somebody shared with me once was an emergency room. When a patient is brought in crisis, depending on in the initial assessment, one healthcare professional or another is going to take over and start barking orders depending on their specialty and their area of expertise as to what's going on. That's really what we have in the performing stage. And then lastly, in the adjourning stage, again, it's the wrap up. It's really what I love to see in the adjourning stage is the lessons learned activity, is really taking a trip down memory lane and saying, where did we work well together? Where could we have done things differently? Can we record this? Can we share this? And can we make sure to take it into whatever future teams that we'll be working on? So if I could, summarize this by, putting it into a single verb, forming, the leader is directive. And really functioning as more of a directive leader style. Storming, they are directive but with facilitation. Norming, facilitating. Performing, monitoring. and then a little bit of facilitation at the end. And so what you should see, like a visual image, is literally the leader stepping further and further away from a leader role, possibly repositioning him or herself more as a fellow team member, an equal team member. Now, why is this important? When I've worked with teams that are in trouble, normally what I do find, one of the issues I find, is a team leader who is not adapting and adjusting as the team grows, and instead is sticking, in many cases, in a more directive role. I worked with a senior team once that was really stuck in forming because the CEO could not do that step back role that I am describing. And I was doing some team observations, and then one month when I went back, the CEO was on vacation. And what a difference it made. The team was literally moving quickly to being high-performing, collaborative, and supportive of each other. That with the CEO's presence, they were in a let's sit and wait until he tells us what to do next role. It was very, very glaring. So again, the leadership, the team lead, no matter who is from the beginning chartered to running this, has got to understand this pulling back method, or the team will get stuck way back in forming and or storming sometimes and never really get to the high performing. Kevin, has that been your experience?
Yeah, very much so. I find that I have to become kind of the boss whisperer to the team lead oftentimes, just to suggest, yeah, it's like, kind of whispering in their ear. Or I've negotiated sometimes with teams with the executive in charge of the team to kind of real time hit the pause button while we're in the meeting and ask the boss, how do you think it's going? What are you noticing? And it's a real time way to surface untested assumptions, because I think in more traditional environments, many times participants on a team just assume that most of the functions of the team are going to fall to the boss. And so the boss is scratching their head trying to figure out, well, why don't these people step up? And so it becomes this interesting dance of untested assumptions. And so I think a lot of times as a diagnostician and an interventionist on a team, my job is to surface those untested assumptions to say, is this really working for you? And so I think your experience is very consistent with mine around that.
Yeah, very, very good point. Okay, and so we have another reflection that I will walk people through. And again, let me set the stage, and then I'll ask those of you on the recording to put the pause and make some notes. Once again, I'm going to ask you to reflect on a team that you are currently a member of. How effective is the team leader in helping sustain performance of the team? If you were leading the team, what actions would you take to regain or sustain high performance? This is a little bit different from before. I want you to come into this reflection as a team member and do a little bit of assessment of what you think the team leader is doing on a positive way to help the team along. And then if you were that person, what would you be doing? What would you be doing the same or differently? So again, those on the recording, please pause. And those who are live with us today, if you could, share your experiences with us on being a team member and observing a team leader. Kevin, other examples you want to share with us of what a team leader is doing that helps?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones is it goes back to the storming stage, but an overall dynamic on a lot of teams. And I think we've even heard this from participants in LDP programs in the past, but that how that fear of conflict can prevent a team from raising tough issues. And so I recall working again, it was a different medical center. I worked with a senior executive and her team of directors. And so, I coached her in advance to be able to model risk taking. The idea of teams do better when they can talk or discuss undiscussables, things that are happening in front of us. It's the elephant dancing in the living room that we all pretend not to see. And so, I had to work with my executive sponsor to help her get to a place to be able to surface, untested assumptions. For example, the willingness to ask the group, Are there things that I'm doing that are getting in your way in terms of how you all function as a team? Or for her to volunteer some of her doubts about certain issues that made her a little bit vulnerable. But it often becomes, in many cases, the reason you're in a leadership role is because you know your job is to guide the team and help them move forward, and sometimes that involves tipping your cards a bit and being a little vulnerable, because if in fact you want people to be vulnerable in the team, you may have to model it. Yeah. How about you? Any thoughts?
Well, one team I'm thinking of in particular, I was a member of, um, again, it was a volunteer situation. And we were in the storming phase, and the one thing I valued so much about the person who was leading at the time was two things. Number one, he was very adept at using humor to diffuse when it got a little bit too too tough, not humor in a degrading way, but humor to kind of lighten the mood, kind of pull people back from the edge. And the other thing I thought that he did that was extremely useful is, again, in storming and even norming, he never ended the meeting without putting things into closure. So if there was a disagreement and people were dug into their sides and we were running out of time, he would go ahead and summarize where we were and where we pick up next time. Because, one of the dangers, again, in storming or in a conflict situation is saying, there's where emotions are heightened and people are locked up and say, oh, meeting over, and just let it hang out there. So I think those are two, techniques that I thought were very, very useful. Let's see what our teammates have shared with us here. Melissa mentions one team I'm a member of suffers because the team leader does everything. Other roles aren't clearly defined. Ugh. Yeah, Melissa, that's forming. And you won't get anywhere unless that person can learn to delegate and step aside. Mandy mentions I'm on one team at the Fabulous, does a great job of getting input, selecting members who are interested and active with the team. When new members join, she does a great job of integrating them, receiving our mission and values as a team. And then she's also on a team where the team leader is micromanaging it. Yeah, that's tough. Maryland's IPP team, wonderfully effective members. All involved disciplines are represented. Our team would be more effective if we had more time to devote to this project. Yeah, the meetings are held at times that work well for the leader, but don't always work well. Yeah, that's tough when you've got a nascent team that could be great if you just were able to spend a little bit more time. Dealing most of the task and overlaying the team. Yeah. Yeah, there at Nad's point, you can over-delegate. That's a dump and run leader, which is a different issue. Wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody, for sharing these great real-life examples. I think with these real-life examples, it makes these models really come to life for us. So our third area, components. Kevin, I think you're going to start us off with this.
That's right. So a third layer, so we talked about the stages of teams and how you can use that to diagnose if you're not in performing, where are you? Secondly, we then started thinking about all other dynamics in terms of team leaders and how your role can influence the functioning of a team. Third would be thinking about the components of effective teams. So what are some of the core components that really play an instrumental role in helping move a team into performing and sustaining it? So we've got a list here and a couple things I wanted to point out with the first few. Specifically, we talked about purpose and goals, and that was clear because that was, the core definition of a team implies a shared sense of purpose and really clear outcomes or goals. Secondly, though, I think just as important is this idea of roles and role definition. And I think it's interesting because Marilyn and Mandy, I believe, pointed out that on a team where team leaders doing everything, to me, this is what is at play. Having not defined the role, team leader over functions, people basically learn to become passive because the assumption is team leader's doing it all. And oftentimes then you interview the team leader and they're wondering, why don't these people step up? It's an interesting, untested assumption. But roles, really deciding who's doing what. For example, who's taking minutes, who's going to follow up with other teams, who's going to capture ideas on the flip chart, that kind of thing. Or even roles around decision making. And that's related to the third point there of key processes. Communication, conflict resolution. That comes up with significant frequency in teams that I work with, which is talking about how we'll resolve conflict. In other words, for example, some teams I've worked with decide that whoever two members that are in conflict, they need to go off and try to resolve it themselves before they engage the team leader. And that, that's going to be important work that's done offline and doesn't take valuable team time. But it really is part of defining what those processes are. The other thing that trips up teams a lot is the decision making. Is it the team lead's going to own the decision completely? Or is the team lead going to ask for input from below, from the team members? Or even is it going to be true consensus where everybody's going to have a voice in it, which may take a long time to do that, but that's a great way to do it if in fact you need unanimous or larger base of support for an idea. So those are three really key ones. Alice, you want to speak to the others?
Absolutely. Relationships. Oftentimes when I'm called in, or I'll get a call from a client that says, I need you to do a team building. The team isn't working well. And so, can we go off for a day and do something together? And I'm like, okay, if indeed the problems on the team are that they lack trust, they're not holding each other accountable, that the relationships are not well formed, those types of activities will help. But if, on the other hand, one of these other elements is out of sync, not only will that not help, it will drive people crazy to lose the time to that activity. So what do we mean by relationships? As you can imagine with the talk we did on the stages of team development, if there isn't a good level of trust, people are not going to want to openly engage in conflict. They're not going to want to negotiate decisions, and they're not going to be looking for a win-win solution. So we need to have good, strong working relationships for a team to be effective. Now, as people sometimes say to me, well, I don't really like that person on my team. I'm like, well, you don't need to necessarily like them, but you have to be able to trust them and to trust their point of view and their intentions going into it. So that's what we mean by team relationships. How well do the members work with each other? Now, our fourth area of concern or focus is external to the team. How strong are the relations with other teams in the organization or surrounding the organization, or members or customers or whatever? If a team is very well performing, but they're not also looking externally, their work may not work out as well. What I like to challenge teams in this arena is, where are the cross impacts? Where is the work you're doing going to impact others in a way that, if you're not relating to them well, could derail the work of the team? Our fifth area, again, sort of common sense, resources. The team can be really clear on goals and roles and all of these things, but have inadequate time or budgetary dollars if need be, or not an equal priority to the work. Then that's going to get in the way. And lastly, appropriate leadership. We've talked a bit about that already, so I need not go into it again. But I will share with you, how do I use this page very simply. I take the components column, and when I'm working with a team that needs to be enhanced, needs to move into high performance, I do this as almost a checklist. I will either observe or interview the members. Are they in agreement as to what the purpose and goal is? Are they in agreement and mutually understand what the different roles are? And so on down the line. What I find is that teams that are more short-term, they're chartered to do a specific task that goes for a month or 2 or 3, generally don't have too much of an issue with these. Where I start to see these getting out of sync is with teams that have been together a very long time. And some of the examples we've shared with you on this webinar, a team that's been going for years, and every time there's been membership change, nobody's really gone back and resetting what is the purpose and the vision of this group. Or a team member who's got a very strong role leaves, and the person coming in doesn't have that skill set. So they morph into doing something else on the team. Meanwhile, the person who's left, that role is not being served, and so on down the line. So I think a healthy thing for any team member or team lead to do is to pull this list out as a checklist and do a little assessment. How are we on these 7 different components? Are we where we need to be? Or do we need to go in and fix some of them? Kevin, what's your experience in using a tool like this?
Well, one way to think about these elements, and generally you'll find, and this is true in a lot of the literature, you can think of it in terms of some of these components being more structural and others being more interpersonal or personal. And so it's usually a balance of both, or task and process. But I find that there are interrelationships between these. For example, if the team doesn't have enough resources to achieve its work, then perhaps we've got to go back to purpose and goals and maybe narrow the scope of the team and how it functions. So you can find a lot of these things do have their interdynamics, because teams can be kind of complex as it relates to that. So the kind of leadership you have is going to have bearing on relationships and trust, because if we can't trust the team lead, then that's going to probably infuse the relationships with everybody else that could get in the way of it, or start to form factions or cliques within the team. So, but yeah, this is, I think, a really good basic list to start from, and the idea of starting to observe and even ask the team. I mean, I've even seen, to some extent, you could use this in a team meeting to say, how are we doing on these things, and make it a kind of an inclusive process. How well do we think we're functioning with these different components? What needs to get better for us to move forward and really sustain our performance? Yeah, so it's a really good working list.
That's an interesting observation, Kevin, and one I had not thought of, the interdependency of some of these. And you're right, some of them are almost showstoppers. In other words, if the leadership is ineffective, as some of the examples our folks have shared with us in the chat, it kind of trumps everything else. If the relationships have been broken at some point or another where there's extremely low trust, it doesn't really matter how sound the processes, roles, and purpose are. People are not going to want to move forward. They're going to pull in and pretty much, to mix our models here, pretty much stay way at the beginning of forming and just not get involved with each other. So you're right. That's a very good observation, and I like the issue of doing like an audit, a report card. Where does everybody feel the team is on these components, and how much in alignment are the ratings? If half the team says their roles are very clear and half says they're not, that's a different story. Now, if they all say they're not clear, that's not as bad a problem, because then you just start at the beginning and redefine roles. But yeah, interesting discussion here. Well, Kevin, I think you're going to take us into our next reflection of the day.
Okay, so this is a chance to take this framework of team components and throw it against a team that you're currently on. So think about one you're currently leading, or if you're a member of a team, which of the components do you think are working well, and which do you think, your hypothesis is that we could get to the next level if we address this, because this is maybe a gap area for us. We're not functioning well, and our processes aren't well defined, or interactions, whatever. But take a moment and think about a team and see what you come up with. For those of you listening to the recording, now would be a good time to hit the pause button so you also can reflect on a team in maybe the handout or in your journal. When you're ready to resume, just hit the replay button. So anything you find typically deficient, Allison, to clients you work with these components?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think long-term, long-running teams, ones that have been together for a number of years, I find both the purpose and goals and the roles area can get really so to speak, out of whack. Because people bring to a team their expertise, their experience, whatever. If they leave the team, it's very rare they're going to be replaced with an identical unit. So the new person comes in and switches a role around a little bit or brings their own interpretation of the purpose and goal. And if that's not corrected or realigned, things can get out of sync pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what stands out for me, I'm working with, last year I worked with a team at a medical center, and, related to relationships, and one component was that was camaraderie. And this leadership team realized that they really didn't know each other beyond their work, and their intention was to once a quarter do some planning, but then go out to dinner together, because a lot of magic happens, I think, in those interpersonal relationships when you break bread together. And so the idea is, how can we bring in more fun and camaraderie into our team? And, we often think, well, that's not productive, whatever, but to me that often is a great place to go, because I find that it enhances fluidity in the relationship, so that even, when there's conflict, if there's fluidity and trust, it's not a big deal. I come to you, we discuss it, we move on. It doesn't have to be a belabored, dramatic point that can really drag down the team. So I think that to me is really huge. So let's take a look at some of what our team has shared here, our participants, in terms of some of their sharings, and we'll get some chat here in a minute. But anything you want to underscore, Alice, before we go to the classroom and see what our participants share?
Well, I want to key off of your example, and I think that's so telling. In the world of work, where we tend to focus much more, this is my editorial statement, much more on task than on the interpersonal side. What's the next thing on the list? What do we got to get done? What's our task for the day? And what happens then is we have relationships that I would call, they're rather fragile. There's not a strong basis. It's kind of like, I'm a terrible gardener, and sometimes when I plant things, they grow up and then they don't have enough roots and they fall over. So it's sort of the same analogy there. But taking the time to do those sharing things, just go out for dinner and ban all business talk. Nobody can say business, or they have to pay for the dinner or something like that. And get people to open up, I think, is just so important, because that then becomes the basis, the foundation, that when things get rough, people are willing to give more of each other. Yeah.
So a couple thoughts. Ned, you point out that purpose and goals among the team leads that aren't shared with the team members, boy, talk about a disconnect. That is not sustainable. So it's a really good perspective of how do we build alignment. I guess that's a really important term in teams. But Marilyn, purpose and goals are fine. Processes are a little bit more bumpy, which, Marilyn, I've experienced quite often. I think it's very common. And then also reinforce the comment about relationship building through social interactions. Yeah, we're not machines, we're human, and human needs interaction and in building and sustaining relationships. So excellent. So really some really good ideas. And then Mandy's believes that clarifying roles and responsibilities would be useful in one of my teams. Mandy, a really easy way to do that I've seen is have everybody on the team write down what they think what are the key roles on this team, and or who is doing that. And everybody, without discussing it, writes it down and then pass it to the right and keep passing it to the right. So it's a really quick way to gather data about a team on any topic. It could be, what is our goal for this team? Everybody write what they think it is down and then just pass it around the room, and you'd be amazed at what you discover. So it's a good one. So I think we're probably close to the end of our time. Alice, do you want to tie us together here?
I would be happy to. So we've gone down the road today to provide you with some useful tools to work with your teams. Number one, what stage are they in? Are they stuck? If they are, what can you do to help them out? Our team leaders, how are they adjusting as the team grows and evolves? And lastly, where are you with those critical team components? As always, we like to end with giving you a glimpse of what to do after this if you want to continue your learning about teams. Do some reflection on a peak performing team that you were part of. Why was it? What happened? Are there lessons learned you can carry to a new team? Share the ideas you've gained today with somebody that you're on a team with. See if together, your heads together might come up with ways to move the team forward. And notice the stage of team development that you are on, of the teams you are on. Reflect on components that may be missing. Use these tools to further your teams. And so with that, I'd like to pass the mic back to Andrea to wrap for today.
Thank you, Kevin and Alice, and thank you everyone for joining us. This webinar is part of a series in ASHA's Leadership Academy. For more information, including information on continuing education credits, visit www.asha.org and search Leadership Academy. We also encourage you to join the ASHA community focused on leadership topics. Go to asha.org and search Leadership Academy. You will find a link to the online community on this page. This concludes the ASHA Leadership Academy webinar on high-performing teams. Goodbye from the ASHA National Office.